we are going to move quickly and seamlessly into the second session of the Tortoise Climate Summit, where we are going to present the results of the new Tortoise Climate Index. And right at the top, let's say many thanks to Teneo for partnering with us on this project. We're very grateful for their support. So over the next 45 minutes, maybe slightly less, thanks to James, we'll talk through the main findings of the index, which seek to measure the critical issue of how effectively and transparently the FTSE 100 are addressing climate change. The index has grown out of the broader Tortoise Responsibility 100 index, and this measures FTSE corporate responsibility across a number of different areas, and is released today in its sixth edition. And both indices have been put together by quite a crack team at Tortoise, headed by my colleague Alexandra Mazavizadeh, and including Luke Bedimer, Kim Dara, Ellen Halliday, and Patricia Clark. Alexandra and Luke are here today to take us through the findings. You might have heard James say in the first session that we really encourage participation. Think-ins aren't panel discussions. We really want to hear from you. And that particularly applies in discussions about indexes, because it really, really helps us to hear your comments, thoughts on the methodology in particular and the findings, criticism. Kim, who is moderating, will pick up any of the comments that you make in the chat, and also you can raise your blue hand and I'll try and bring you into the conversation. As James mentioned, there's a loose rule, no questions. We want to hear from you. And lastly, I have to say this session is being recorded, and we'll clip some of it to social media. So let's kick off. Let's turn first to Alexandra to give us the headlines of the index, what it is, what's the Climate 100 Index, how it came about, what it measures, and why it's important to measure this in the context of a broader net zero objective. And then afterwards, we'll turn to Luke to rattle through some slides showing us the key findings, and then we'll dig into some of those findings later. So Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you, Alexi. And thank you, and also thank you, James and Nigel, for that great session before. Actually, the whole reason we have the Responsibility Index and now the Climate 100 Index is because James asked the question right at the beginning of setting up Tortoise, is how we hold companies to account, and how is the best way to do that. And I looked at him with a slightly sort of tired look and said, but you know, it's a very crowded space. And he said, but what's not out there? And what wasn't out there is looking at what and setting companies up against what they're saying they're doing versus what they're actually doing. So that is actually the reason why we have the framework for the index the way it is today, where we look at companies' talk versus their walk. And as Alexi said, the R100 is in its sixth edition and released today, but it is the first climate cut we've ever done. And of course, we're doing that because of the urgency of the topic and the need for encouraging acceleration in decarbonisation, but also for pushing for better reporting and increased transparency at this time is more urgent than ever. And this is exactly what the Climate Index does. And what we do try to capture is that we measure companies actually on their rate of change, and we reward those companies that report on it. So that's how we measure the walk side of the index. But we also look and take a very close look at their talk side, even though it doesn't actually get incorporated in the actual ranking of the companies. But we look at the walk side because it is important to get a sense of, you know, how fast are companies moving towards these divestments and decarbonisation, or at least planning to do so. So when we try and capture these targets, we look both, of course, at the companies that have set these net zero commitments by 2050, of which there's 64. But we also look at maybe the more demanding targets that are structured by the Science Based Target Initiative. And 43 of the FTSEs have committed to these targets, but only actually 24 have set them. So we're keeping a very close eye on the target side, so we can try and map or cross over what companies are saying they will be doing or saying that they're committed to, and look at how that translates in the performance of the companies on these metrics. But overall, what we're really trying to set out is a consistent, clear, and comparable benchmark. And as we are ahead of COP26, really talking about how we converge on a set of metrics globally that we can all start to measure and map and track against, it is very important that that we tease out the reporting and support the disclosure and make it clear that that is very important. Hence, one of the key components or principles of this index is that it rests on publicly available data, is that we are trying to encourage that transparency. We're trying to push for reporting. So that's why we also reward companies that maybe not in the past have reported on something, but actually now do report on it. That is something that we reward in the index. But it is probably just worth just quickly going through some of the things that we do look at when we look at the actual performance. And of course, we look very closely at companies against their mandatory reporting on scope 1 and 2, but we also reward companies that are reporting on their scope 3, which not all do. About 48 of the FTSEs do that. And we also track closely the reductions in emissions intensity. We reward energy usage from renewable sources. We look at energy use in general. We look at water usage, reduction in waste to landfill, percentage of waste that's recycled or reused, and about 25 indicators go into the climate performance rank, which is in the chat. I think the link is in the chat there for all to go and take a very careful look at how the companies are performing on all of these measurements, but also what they're actually committed to in terms of their targets on net zero, but also specifically on their science-based targets. I think probably I won't take up too much more time because I know we want to really dive into the meat of the index and have a look at the top and the bottom and who's performing well and who isn't and why. So, Alexi, I think maybe we should turn to the slides and have a look at who's performing how.
Yeah, that would be great. And actually, I realized that I've only seen a draft version of the top 10 and bottom 10. And I think it was changing right up until the last minute. So, Luke, reveal who is top of the Climate 100 Index, if you wouldn't mind, and run us through the 5 slides that you've prepared outlining the key findings.
Absolutely. So as it's clear, that this is per our findings, this is the top 10 of the Climate 100 Index. And to just elaborate a bit on what Alexandra was explaining, it's a combination both of performance in actual terms, rate of change over time, and transparency in reporting. And to dwell a little bit on that second point of rate of change over time, one of the reasons that these indices are quite powerful tools for influencing and informing is that they can choose an underlying concept and really stress the importance of that concept. And what we've done here with the Climate 100 is really to stress the importance of moving towards a better situation in the future. So some of the rankings here can be explained by the fact that companies with large footprints in terms of emission, energy use, waste, etc., are moving more quickly than others to reducing that footprint. There's a very reasonable take on this, which is that the situation here is that not many of these large companies should be tolerated in terms of their impact on the environment, and they've got to move and they've got to change in the near future. Just to echo something that Nigel was saying with regards to the lack of a short-term plan. If you're making changes in the next 5 years or the next 2 years or the next 1 year with regards to reducing your emissions intensity or your use of energy or increasing the amount of that that's coming from renewable sources, then we believe that's a factor worth drawing attention to. So one thing that unites the top 10 here is that all of them are reporting comprehensively on significant change over time towards a more sustainable situation with regards to those key indicators.
Luke, I was going to rattle through the slides and then come back to the top 10, but since the slide is up here, why don't we kind of pause here for a bit look at the top 10 a bit more closely, and we'll bring Alexandra in, and maybe anyone that wants to contribute, you can read the top 10 here. If anyone's surprised or has any comments to make, then put it in the chat and we'll bring you into the conversation. My question, I suppose, for Alexandra, maybe you want to pick this one up, is, just looking at it, you've got two land companies at the top, then Burberry, which is so you've got two building companies. You've got Burberry, which is a fashion company, Unilever, BT, which in telecoms. I think you've got an information analytics company there, all quite diverse sectors. What characteristics do you need as a company to have to put you in the top 10 of the Climate 100 Index?
Yeah, I mean, as Luke was pointing to before, it is really looking. I mean, we drill down into that rate of change, right? So, if you have seen a reduction in emissions, or or increase in renewable energy, or reduced your waste to landfill, which is the case across these companies, you really get rewarded in this index, because we're pointing to the rate of change, which lies at the heart of the principle of the accelerating net zero commitments. But it's also something. The comprehensive reporting is actually also something you'll see as a characteristic in the top 10. If you report comprehensively, right, you will also get rewarded here. So going from not reporting on waste, for example, to reporting on it, you get a point for reporting on it, and of course then we track the change.
Okay, so it's a combination of rate of change, transparency, and performance. When we were talking about this before, Luke, we talked a little bit about Unilever, and Unilever has I think been at the top of a couple of our indices on responsibility, and is number 4 in the Climate 100, and yet it is, I think, the 8th largest emitter in the whole of the FTSE. So this isn't kind of bringing up anything new. You've kind of already explained it, but just in the case of Unilever, should we really be putting such a big emitter in the top 5 in a climate index?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I think it goes directly to the heart of what you're trying to achieve when you want to influence people's thought around what's tolerable and what's not tolerable in the way that companies behave. The fact that Unilever's footprint is so large is actually one of the reasons why they're able to make large percentage reductions. And there's been a real effort, evidenced by the data that we've seen, to change fundamentally the way that Unilever impacts the environment across the indicators that we've seen, we've mentioned already: emissions, energy use, waste, water. And so I guess specifically to your question, none of these companies are harmless. None of them are green light, brilliant actors. The reality of this index is that we're looking at the FTSE 100, and therefore some of 500 of the largest companies in the world, and those that have an enormous impact on the world around them. Unilever have made considerable commitments, as well as considerable actual change in recent years with respect to what we measure in the Responsibility 100 and now the Climate 100 Index. So if you want to really understand what's going on here, you can't just look at the rankings. You also need to look at the data that underlies the rankings, specifically to the rate of change here, because we're not suggesting that Unilever, Burberry, British Land have all sussed it, have all sorted what it is to be a large company in a world that needs to radically decarbonize and urgently get to net zero. But what we have signposted is the data that indicates the companies that are moving quickly, and that seem to have a short-term plan.
And Alexi, one last point on that. It's interesting actually to see, now we've today released both indices, and you see the crossover that Land Securities and British Land also do very well on the R100, as was pointed out before. But you can see there's also a real step change. These companies have always been in the top 10, but the step change is seen not only on the climate metrics, but also across the board over in the other areas of what we measure in the R100, which is aspects of, equality and modern slavery and so on. So we can see there's a sort of been a big push, not just on climate, but across the board for these companies.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'd like to bring in a couple of people in the chat now, if I might. There are a few points being made that I think Kim would be best placed to pick up over text. But if we could come to Emily Gibson, please, if you're there, Emily. You're making quite an interesting point about the relevance of past performance and whether a company, as far as I understand your point, whether a company in the FTSE can basically do nothing until last year or 2 years, and then if it then kind of changes, then is it disproportionately rewarded in the index? Is that why don't you make the point?
Yeah, sure. Hi everybody. And really great to hear the conversation today and to see the index. Yeah, I think that, we all know that, I guess, the pathway of decarbonization needs to accelerate. And we talk about, halving emissions. That was very clear in Davos in 2020. It was sort of, you need to cut them in half and then you need to do it again and again. And obviously, companies are at different stages on that journey. We all talk about low-hanging fruit, through things like efficiency improvements and then, energy source switching. And everyone's kind of deploying a version of a playbook, let's say, but obviously some companies have been sort of using the playbook, sort of opened it up, if you will, to keep the analogy going, opened it up sooner, if you will. And so in many cases, the decade, up to 2020, let's say, some of that low-hanging fruit has been harvested, and then you're going after the more tricky areas, if you will. So I guess it's just understanding that. So I work for Diageo, and obviously we've been working to decarbonize our business since 2008. And in many of that, the decade that we finished in terms of our target cycle up to 2020 was very much around manufacturing excellence, reconfiguration of processes, shift to renewable electricity, and the beginnings of the innovation. But we find ourselves in that second phase of the decarbonization journey. So we achieved a 50% reduction absolute up to 2020, and now we're going after the other 50%. So it's just, I think this is a really fantastic way of looking at the data, but just understanding how you think about that dynamic would be really, really helpful. Thank you.
Alexandra, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I just thought I wanted to give Kim a chance to, did she want to come in on that? Kim, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So we look at both sort of direction of travel and the sort of absolute metrics on things like emissions, but we also really heavily look at like how well a company is reporting on things. So I suppose like as you become sort of more mature in the cycle towards decarbonizing, that would be when you would get to a point when you're already reporting really well on things, and you're already and your absolute emissions by then will be lower as well. So we sort of we look at direction of change, but we also take into account the sort of broader sort of level of transparency. And often companies haven't got to that point yet. But does that answer your question? Sorry.
Emily, is that covered? Do you have a point to come back with?
Yeah, good. No, whoops, sorry. Can you hear me? So yeah, I mean, I think I guess yes and no. I think I think what we're talking about, I guess what I'm quite interested in understanding, and I think we find ourselves at a very interesting point, is we're talking about the acceleration of movement forward, but it's off of a baseline of action to date. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you've already cut it in half and then you're cutting it in half again, that's a slightly different dynamic than if you've cut it by 10% and then you're going after the remaining 90%. So I think it's fantastic, the thinking. I think it's just, I think that's a really interesting dialogue to get into, because I think also there's lots of learnings from companies that have been at the absolute greenhouse gas reduction trajectory, as opposed to kind of efficiency improvement, let's say, for longer. So it's sort of what have players that have been doing that learned, because it's much harder than anyone would ever anticipate, which is why we find ourselves with such as a world with this need to accelerate. So I think it's just how do we think about that, and then how do we build on those learnings from absolute reduction to carry that forward across sectors for this decade ahead. If that makes sense.
Thank you so much. Well, we could talk about just that particular question for the next 20 minutes, but I would like to bring in, if I could, Paul Lee, who has made an interesting point in the chat about the difference between financial reporting and narrative reporting in this area. Paul, do you want to make your point?
Yeah, sure. So I'm leading a project that's looking at precisely this gap between what companies are saying and what they're doing. We're looking in a slightly different way from clearly the way that Tortoise has looked at it, which is looking at the difference between the narrative reporting, the words in the front half of the annual report, if you like, and the numbers, the financials in the back half of the annual report. And Nigel Topping talked earlier about the need for companies to be making investments in the next 5-10 years to enable them to deliver on those net zero promises that they're making for 2030, 2050. And frankly, what we're seeing so far is that there's not much evidence of that there is very little integration of the climate thinking into the financials, and very little talk about it. There's loads of talk in the words in the narrative reporting, and almost no coverage in the financials, unfortunately. And until that happens, I personally certainly find it hard to believe that companies are really delivering in this space and really going to deliver, on their net zero promises.
And Alexandra, just before I turn to you to ask you about how we have looked at talk and walk, Paul, what do you think? Firstly, is this a problem across the corporate landscape, or are some companies that you've looked at, is there a smaller gap between what they're promising and what they're delivering? Are some companies actually doing what they say? And do we need more incentives? Do we need to be tying executive remuneration to delivery on these principles in order to actually get stuff done?
I mean, I think the link to executive pay is one of the reasons why, actually, frankly, it's not in the financials, because it's a great deal easier to continue to be paid well if you haven't started to build in some of the challenges that climate's going to bring. If you're reporting profits on the assumption that we're going to continue as business as usual, you're going to look a lot better than perhaps you might if you start to properly integrate issues. Yes, there are some companies that are doing it better, and actually the UK businesses do look a lot better than the international companies that we're looking at. We're looking globally. UK companies have at least started to talk about climate in their financials, and indeed UK auditors have started to talk about it in their audit reports. They still haven't gone far enough. The integration isn't significantly delivered, but they're at least starting that conversation. In most of the world, that conversation hasn't even begun, unfortunately. So we're we can be a little bit proud of ourselves, but we've got a long way to go still.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, thank you so much for that question. It's a very good one. There's sort of two aspects to that. One is sort of the talk versus walk, but then there's also the sort of commitments and how that is built into the financials and the financial side. And actually, it was so interesting to hear Nigel just before mention the question or the decision that Moody's had made, a rating agency, to build that cost into its financial assessment of a company. And I think we're probably going to see a lot more of that. There's many initiatives that are looking at sort of, carbon weighted, financial assessment initiatives that we're seeing on the horizon. But I think just to go back on the sort of the talk versus walk and the linking to CEO bonuses, I mean, at present, there is no authority that holds companies to account on the targets that are made, right? And in terms of talk, I mean, in the first iteration of the index, we just looked at actually the talk and the mentions and sort of the signaling that companies were making on these issues. And then we actually move to, we really need to drill down and only capture things that are actual targets, that are specific, that are time bound, and that are measurable. And that's what we capture in the index. But then linking that to performance and looking at how that is linked to just the CEO remuneration is that only actually 5 of the FTSEs have CEO remuneration or bonuses linked to climate performance. Only 5, right? So that link that is even, it is not strong enough in itself. Only 5 of the FTSEs do that. And so then there's the sort of the next order of magnitude, and that is linking it to financial performance and looking at it as not anticipating or looking at your climate impact as being a cost is a mistake. But I do think that we're probably going to be moving towards some approaches to how that might be ways in which that we're going to bake in the climate performance into financial performance over time.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's such a clear example, isn't it, of something that, if it's changed, could actually really, really drive positive change. I didn't know that figure, Alexandra. That's worrying and fascinating in equal measure. Okay, well, look, we don't have that much time. I'm sure that there are more details in the actual Climate 100 report that people can dig into if they want, about why companies like BT are in the top 10. But should we move on to the bad guys? Phoebe, our tech host, do you mind shifting the slide over one slide, I think, to the bottom 10? And Luke, give us a rundown of who's in that list.
Well, I appreciate the framing, but I'd maybe go further to say that there are no good guys or bad guys in the index. There's just a sort of realistic picture of what companies are doing. We've tried to present them in a sensible way. If we call them bad guys, the bad guys are here because their footprints in actual terms are large, or they fail to disclose how large their footprints are. Both carry significant risks, and both are very significant when it comes to accelerating net zero. Just picking up on a few examples: Glencore, Evraz, BP, BHP, we know have large extractive operations and really impact the environment around. I apologize for anybody who's not able to read the slides clearly. I think it does depend a little bit on the latency of your connection. So I can list them now to say that the bottom 10 are BHP, Avas, DCC, Glencore, Ashtead, Evraz, HomeServe, BP, Just Eat, and Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust, in descending order. And as I was saying, it's really an issue of slow rate of change, large actual impact, or complete opacity when it comes to what impact companies are actually having in terms of their downstream effects.
Okay, well, let's talk about lack of transparency, because that is, as you say, Luke, a very important reason why people, why companies fall down this index. Just explain. Lots of people on the call will know, but for those who don't, just explain Scope 1 and 2 emissions, Scope 3 emissions, the legal obligation to report the former, and the fact that quite a lot of companies don't report the latter and get penalized in the index for that.
Well, this is something we'll see on the next slide with a bit of a visual that might help explain. But by and large, it goes from being direct to indirect to more disassociated as you move from Scope 1 to Scope 2 to Scope 3. There are some legal requirements for reporting of Scope 1 and 2, your direct and indirect emissions, which means the energy that you use and the emissions that are a consequence of the energy that you use being produced, as well as everything you do from packaging to the use of vehicles or other infrastructure that you own. And increasingly, there's a push to include the emissions impact of changes that you make to the environment in buildings and the use of those buildings. So lots of companies talk about operational control, especially in the extractive industries. And they talk about operational control being the way to decide which types of emissions are the ones for which you're responsible directly. indirect responsibility really means we're talking about scope 3 emissions. And if we move to the next slide.
Give me an example of a scope 3 emission.
Well, a scope 3 emission would be, one of the best examples is when BP sells some petrol, the emissions that are a consequence of that sale and use of the petrol would be scope 3 emissions with respect to BP. I mean, the same is true of any other energy or fuel provider. So part of the explanation is on the next slide, if we can move to that, and look at the proportion and relative impact of the top emitters in the FTSE 100. This graphic's obviously sized by emissions footprint, and here you can see that the extractive companies have the largest footprints in the FTSE, but also just how much of their footprint is taken up by scope 3 emissions, which is shown in the light blue, whereas the direct scope and indirect scope 1 and 2 emissions are shown in the dark blue. The point to stress here as well, like you mentioned, Alexi, is that only the direct and indirect emissions, the scope 1 and 2, are subject to any legal requirement for reporting. So a company like Evraz, which is shown here in the top emissions, they haven't disclosed their scope 3 emissions. Even with that being the case, they still appear amongst the top emitters in the FTSE because their footprint is very large. But really, there needs to be a push and a transition towards better management and recognition of scope 3 emissions, because at present, yeah.
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt. Evraz is an interesting example of, I know you don't like this term, but I'm a former newspaper journalist, so bad guy in the sense that it doesn't report scope 3 and it's already quite high in terms of its scope 1 and 2 extraction. Is there any extractive or energy company that you've spotted when you were putting this index together that is trying to boost transparency at the same time as cutting emissions, and did that cause it to be driven up the index?
Yeah, so we've actually got two examples. One is BHP, a mining extractive company, and they ceased reporting of scope 3 emissions. The reason being, they said that they were taking the period to assess their impact through scope 3. They weren't going to provide a combined figure, and they were going to do so in the future. And the interesting thing about that is that lots of companies feel that reporting a scope 3 total makes them look bad, because as we can see here, the numbers are huge, but the actual source of the emissions is only indirectly in their control. Yes, it's true that if fossil fuel energy providers did not provide fossil fuel to end use consumers in the market, those emissions would not emerge. So we would call them sort of consequential from their actions, but they don't actually use the cars or combustion engines or generators that produce the emissions. So there's a tension around responsibility that really comes to the fore with scope 3 emissions. And I think that's why it's important for everybody, to be aware of them. Many people are sort of, they wouldn't necessarily think as clearly about the fact that emissions come as a consequence of all sorts of things happening after a good has been sold, but also to push for them to be treated in the same way that scope 1 and 2 are treated, which is subject to some mandatory reporting requirements. And because without seeing this picture, the picture on the slide at the moment, we really don't understand the emissions footprint that companies have.
Okay, so just before we turn to COVID, which is kind of the elephant in the room in terms of how the last 12 months have affected the positions of the companies on the index, let's just pick up on one other company in the bottom 10, which has raised some questions from Elena and other people in the chat. Just Eat. So Just Eat is pretty interesting, right? Because not only are their practices potentially quite environmentally unsustainable, all that takeaway packaging that we're just throwing away. They are one of only 2 companies that I think you found that don't even report scope 1 and 2 emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And in our methodology, the lack of reporting on scope 1 and 2 emissions, it's like the cornerstone of reporting on your environmental impact. That being missing results in a big limitation on your overall score, where you could look at it as a negative impact. We think that's important because of the reason that Alexandra's described well, and we've talked about previously, which is that without understanding the scale of these problems, without measuring, we really can't monitor, and therefore we can't push for change. So Just Eat in particular are subject to quite a strange jurisdiction-based loophole, which is a result of being operationally based in the UK, but administratively based in the Netherlands. And as a consequence, there are parts of the activities that are not subject to the mandatory reporting requirement. That means we do have good data coverage for most of the FTSE. Besides, another interesting thing, like you mentioned, Alexi, is that their practices are quite confusing when it comes to emissions and to that idea of consequential emissions that we were just talking about, which is if you have a fleet of vehicles, typically if you own those vehicles, then those emissions from the use of those vehicles will be counted in your direct emissions. With Just Eat, they have a large number of vehicles that help their business to operate. They don't own them. The relationship to those vehicles with Just Eat is not very clear at all. So I think we need to see some change in the way that companies are understood and therefore required to report around their emissions, for sure.
Just so I understand on Just Eat, there is a legal obligation on large companies to report scope 1 and scope 2 emissions data. 98 of the FTSE 100 do so. Just Eat doesn't do so because it's taking advantage of the fact that it is headquartered or abroad, or that its corporate structure is set up in such a way that it is not legally obliged to do what 98 other companies in the FTSE do. Is that correct? Is that right?
Yes, yeah. As far as we can determine, it's something that we definitely at Tortoise need to look into further. Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people are making points in the chat about Just Eat. Mark Sutcliffe, sorry, I didn't tell Phoebe, our tech host, that I might want to come to Mark. But if Mark's around, do you just want to make a point about Just Eat's customer base and how vulnerable they might be to a social media eco-awareness campaign? Mark, are you around? Maybe not. I think his name has gone. It's okay. We might come back to. Oh, there he is.
Got him.
Hi.
Hiya. You all right?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
What do you think? Just Eat.
Well, I mean, they're all over the TV advertising schedules with a massive media campaign, which is incredibly memorable. But I'd have thought their core demographic is actually wants to be quite eco-aware. And you'd have thought that they would be very vulnerable to a kind of targeted social media campaign on this. I mean, somebody's pointed out that they run electric bikes and e-scooters in London on their deliveries. But I think the reality for anybody who's used their services, it's a 10-year-old Nissan Sunny or something that the takeaway arrives in lots of provincial areas. And those aren't the most environmentally friendly means of getting food from A to B.
Mm.
Yeah, and I suppose, there's also the fact that we can't tell either way because they're not reporting in the first place, which seems very odd to me in itself. Anyway, one for us to look at. We don't have much time left, so Alexandra, can I come back to you and ask you about COVID? Mm-hmm. Because over the last 12 months, obviously sectors like transport have been decimated by the pandemic. How is that showing up in the index?
Thanks, Alexi. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but sort of just briefly, I mean, you've seen the biggest drop in emissions in a long time across the FTSEs because of the pandemic, right? Because of suspension of operations, people are working from home, there's not the same level of activity. So it's to be expected. And I think we are probably not far from seeing that changing radically when the world kicks into normalcy again and will rev up that, hopefully with being much more mindful about how they do it and how energy efficient and how this recovery can actually be green. But yes, absolutely. We saw the reduction in energy use in some, Burberry is a good example of that. But we then also saw companies, because of COVID, increasing emissions and increasing the energy use, such as it's on the website. But I mean, and I don't think we have a slide on that. But companies such as Sainsbury's and others that have sort of in the process of COVID, increased their emissions for various reasons. But we have seen the impact of that for sure, and we've seen the impact of that across the sectors. That would be, pretty obvious, where you would see that airlines and so on will be reducing their emissions because of the collapse in travel, of course. So I think the interesting point is to see sort of as that reemerges, how does that reemerge across those indicators that we capture? That yes, operating is of course to be expected, but can you do that in an energy friendly and a climate friendly way? And that's what we will definitely keep an eye out as it ramps up.
And the index doesn't distinguish, does it, between, in other words, it gives points to a company that has reduced emissions, whether or not that reduction has taken place as a result of COVID or otherwise?
Yeah, it is. Well, it doesn't take the reasoning into account why the reduction is happening. And also quite important to point out, the index is sector agnostic. And the reason why we do that was very deliberate, in that we believe that these indicators are common denominators that all companies should adhere to, no matter what. And we recognize that for some, an indicator like waste to landfill and looking at that might not be that relevant, and we try and take care of that in the way that we incorporate the indicators. But generally speaking, the principle of it is that these are aspects and these are climate metrics that all companies should be reporting against and monitoring and tracking.
Okay, well, just for the last couple of minutes, let's talk about targets, because I know that the Climate 100 Index doesn't integrate what a company says into a company's position on the index, but we still measure a company's talk, as you guys label it. So given that the talk isn't integrated into the index itself, how important are targets in general in terms of measuring and holding companies to account in terms of climate performance?
I mean, we didn't incorporate them because we really wanted to focus the eye on the performance, right? So we really wanted to make it clear that time's up, and while we do measure the gap between the talk and the walk, we really want to have people and companies focus on actual performance. But it is nonetheless really important to look. When we look at the direction of travel on performance, we also look at the direction of travel on targets. So as I mentioned before, so we've got 64 of the FTSEs that have net zero commitments by 2050. We've got 43 that have signed up for science-based targets, but only 24 of those have actually committed to that. And the reason why that's important, and the distinction, both of these targets are of course important, but the net zero commitment, I mean, is really important for the impact on the planet. The science-based targets are also important because they're a third-party validated organization that has really looked at whether this is feasible. And we track that in detail. We look at what companies have set as target. We look at how specific they are, if they're time-bound and if they're measurable. And we track against that. And we look at what time bound, time length that they're committed to, and we map that out with the view to keep a track on the performance against these targets. And so we do rank companies on their targets. It's in the website where you can see the difference between sort of the strength of the robustness of the talk side versus the ranking on the performance side, and trying to draw a line between the two over time.
And just to be clear for anyone who wants to dig more into this data and this information, are both the 6th edition of the R100 and the Climate 100 Index going to be available on the Tortoise website? How do people access them?
Yes, they're on the Tortoise website. I think my colleagues have put it in the chat, But there are, on the Responsibility 100 site, you'll see the fresh Responsibility 100 index, and there are link also to the Climate 100 index. And there's also a separate site on the Accelerating Net Zero, where you're going to find a link to the Climate 100 index specifically, along with a full report of the Climate 100 index. And thanks to the brilliant team being able to drill into the findings of the Climate 100 and really pull it all together in a report that was also just released this morning. So I really encourage people to go online and download the report and have a good read through it. And please do get in touch with us if you've got any questions.